It began not with a whisper, but with a tremor of desperation. On a cracked, sun-bleached sidewalk in Lahore, a frail 12-year-old boy lay curled beside the relentless bustle of humanity. His school uniform hung from his bones, more thread than fabric, dirt-streaked and faded. His lips were dry, eyes glazed, stomach hollow. The smell of frying samosas curled through the air, warm and sharp, dragging his senses toward a small cart nestled beneath a faded umbrella. The vendor, a man in his late 40s with salt-threaded hair and weary eyes, noticed the boy before he spoke. Without hesitation, he scooped a samosa into a paper bag and walked over. No questions, no scolding, just a hand offering mercy. The boy's fingers trembled as they received it. Steam kissed his face. It wasn't just food. It was survival. That moment, though neither of them knew it, would echo across decades and fortunes. Days turned into weeks, and the boy returned every afternoon, never asking, never begging. He'd sit quietly on the same patch of sidewalk, dirty knees drawn to his chest, waiting. And every time, without fail, the vendor passed him a snack. One samosa. Sometimes two. Occasionally a small glass of chai when he sold well. They didn't speak much, but a silent ritual grew between them. One afternoon, the vendor said, "You study hard?" The boy nodded. "Then don't stop." That was it. But it was the first time anyone had expected anything of him. And in that moment, the vendor didn't just feed a stomach. He fed hope. The boy began to change. His shoulders straightened. His hair was still unkempt, his uniform still torn, but his eyes burned with a different fire now. He showed up earlier, waited more attentively. And one day, he placed a folded piece of paper beside his food. "And my grades," he said shyly. The vendor opened the page slowly, squinting at the faded ink. A row of top marks. "I knew it," the vendor said with a grin. "Smart ones always carry hunger in their eyes." The boy beamed. It was the first time someone had seen him, not just as a poor child, but as potential. As seasons passed, the boy became part of the street's rhythm. Other vendors nodded to him. Customers recognized his quiet presence. He began helping after school, wiping tables, fetching change, organizing ingredients. The vendor never asked, but he never stopped him either. One evening, as the sky turned amber, the vendor gave him an extra bag. "For your mother," he said. The boy blinked. "How do you know? You eat slow. Always save half." It was the first time anyone had noticed. He nodded, lips pressed tight, and took the bag home. That night, his mother wept over a samosa. Years rolled on. The boy grew into a teenager, taller, leaner, with clearer speech and sharper eyes. He still helped at the cart, still shared samosas with his mother. But now he also studied under street lamps, pages fluttering in the breeze. He talked about dreams, of becoming someone. The vendor never laughed. One night he said, "Dreams need fuel. Keep eating." The boy chuckled. "And you keep cooking." They grinned at each other under the hum of city lights. Two souls bound by struggle, survival, and something unspoken. Neither said goodbye. But one day, the boy didn't return. The vendor waited. A day. Then 2. Then weeks. The boy never came. The cart still sizzled, the oil still danced, but the sidewalk was empty where he used to sit. Some said the boy got into a better school. Others said he moved. No one knew for sure. The vendor kept setting aside a samosa every evening, placing it gently in a bag, and watching the corner with quiet hope. Rain fell. The seasons shifted. But he never stopped. Sometimes he would mutter, "Smart ones always fly." And though he smiled at customers and served the crowd, part of him remained fixed on that boy, on the silence that replaced a ritual. It hurt more than he expected. Far away, in a public library lit by flickering fluorescent lights, the boy sat hunched over a textbook, his eyes straining in the dim glow. He wore a slightly newer uniform now, still worn, but cleaner. A scholarship had pulled him to another district. He missed the vendor, missed the comfort of that simple exchange. But he'd made a promise to keep studying, and so he did. He read through fatigue, scribbled notes with a broken pencil. When hunger gnawed, he bit his tongue, but in the silence he whispered, "Dreams need fuel." And though no samosas were near, the memory of steam and kindness warmed him. The boy excelled, top of his class. Teachers noticed. One mentor asked, "Where did you learn discipline?" The boy paused. "From a street vendor," he replied. He expected me to keep going. That answer spread. Soon he was recommended for a city science competition. He arrived in borrowed shoes, his pants too short, but his voice steady. When asked about energy conversion, he compared it to frying samosas in oil, efficient heat transfer, minimal waste. The judges chuckled, but one leaned forward, intrigued. Who is this kid? By the end, they weren't laughing. He won. With each win, the boy moved further from the street that raised him. A scholarship to an elite high school followed. There, he felt like an outsider, surrounded by polished shoes, fluent English, and students who never skipped meals. But he never forgot who he was. Every weekend, he returned to his old neighborhood, not to eat, but to watch. He stood near the edge, never too close. The vendor hadn't seen him, yet. The cart was still there, the line still long. But one thing had changed. The vendor was slower now, a slight limp in his walk. The boy's fists clenched. He wanted to speak, but not yet. Not until he had more to offer. That night, the boy wrote his first letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a piece of notebook paper scrawled with thoughts. One day, I'll come back. I'll build something that lasts. I'll repay every bite you gave me, with interest. He folded it and slipped it into his bag. The next morning, he placed it in a tin box under his bed. A promise not yet ready to be delivered. Years would pass before it reached its destination. But from that day on, his hunger wasn't for food, it was for legacy. For the man who fed him without asking why. University was a world away from anything the boy, now a young man, had ever known. Towering buildings, digital projectors, debates in accented English. He felt invisible among them at first, a shadow carrying stories no one asked to hear. But he listened, learned fast. And when he spoke, it was with quiet authority. In one seminar, a professor posed a hypothetical. How would you feed a city with no resources? The class murmured, stumped. He raised his hand. Start with one hungry child. Feed him. Teach him. Let him rise. The professor paused. That's not theory, that's philosophy. He smiled. It's both. The class clapped. He sat back, silent. But inside, a seed stirred. He majored in engineering, minored in economics, and devoured knowledge like it was his last meal. But textbooks couldn't teach what he already knew: survival. During his final year, he joined an innovation challenge: design a sustainable street food cart powered by clean energy. Others built on theory. He built from memory. Late nights, he sketched the vendor's cart over and over, refining it, imagining how to make it mobile, efficient, self-fueling. His team laughed at first. That's not scalable, they said. He didn't argue. He built. Hein. When demo day arrived, his cart boiled oil using solar panels and generated zero waste. Judges stood silent, then applauded. One investor approached him after the event. This could work, but you're thinking too small. Have you considered franchising? He hesitated. The idea of turning a memory into a business felt almost blasphemous. But then he thought of the vendor's limp, the long lines, the exhaustion. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was scaling kindness. He nodded. I want to build something dignified for street vendors, a model they can own, not serve. The investor raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious, he replied. So was giving food to a stranger for free. He named the startup after a single word the vendor once used, Umeed, hope. Umeed launched with 3 prototype carts across Lahore. Each cart was owned by a local vendor trained in hygiene, inventory, and digital payments. He stood behind the scenes, no photos, no press. It wasn't about fame. It was about the dignity of labor. One of the first vendors cried during training. "No one's ever given us tools," he said. The young CEO smiled. "Now you build your own future." News spread. Investors lined up. But he kept the pace slow, each cart a tribute. Each one a seed. One night, he walked back to that same street corner from his past. The old vendor was still there, slower, thinner, but serving. The young man didn't approach immediately. He waited, watched from the crowd like he used to. Finally, he stepped forward and ordered a samosa. The vendor didn't recognize him. Not at first. But when their eyes met, something flickered. The young man smiled and held out a paper bag, brand new, crisp, with Umeed printed in gold. Inside it wasn't just food. It was a key. A deed. A letter. The vendor opened it slowly. His hands shook. "Is this?" The young man said. "This cart is yours. And 5 more. The vendor stood in the center of a training room, clean floors, large screen, and a dozen vendors like him seated at attention. He wore a pressed shirt provided by the Umeed Foundation. On screen, his name appeared beneath the title, Franchise Mentor. He was overwhelmed. He had spent decades ignored, invisible. Now, he was being asked to teach. His voice trembled at first, then steadied. "We don't just sell food," he told the group. "We serve dignity. Remember that." Applause followed. Quiet at first. Then, thunderous. Tears stung his eyes. For the first time, his story wasn't just remembered. It was respected. The young CEO sat in his small office, late at night, laptop open, eyes bloodshot. Growth was brutal. Umeed was expanding faster than expected. Partnerships, audits, systems, all demanding. He stared at the screen full of figures and maps. Then he opened a folder labeled Cart Model 0.1. The first sketch. Oil stains still marked the scanned page. He touched the image like it was sacred. Behind every number was a life. Behind every cart, a soul like his. He leaned back and whispered, "This isn't business. This is repayment." Outside, neon signs blinked across the city. Inside, a dream held its ground. News media caught on. $1 billion startup built on street food routes, one headline screamed. Cameras followed him now. Interviews. Speeches. Awards. Yet each time he redirected the spotlight. "The real founders are on the street corners," he'd say. "I just polished the wheels." At one event, he stood beside the vendor, now in his 60s, who struggled to smile beneath the flash of cameras. "I didn't make him," the young man said. "He made me." That line echoed across social media. But the vendor? He just patted the young man's shoulder and muttered, "You always were dramatic." They both laughed. Then came the offer. A major international corporation wanted to buy Umeed. $1 billion valuation. The board was excited. Advisors urged him to accept. "This is your moment," they said. He stared at the contract for hours. Wealth like this could rewrite generations. But deep inside, he heard the vendor's voice, quiet, warm. "We serve dignity." He folded the contract, didn't sign. Instead, he wrote a counter letter. "We will license, not sell. The soul of this cannot be bought." Silence followed. Then, acceptance. The corporation agreed. Umeed stayed independent. His people kept ownership, integrity, intact. On the 5th anniversary of Umeed, dozens of carts rolled down the streets of Lahore in a parade of color, flavor, and music. Vendors wore branded aprons with pride. Crowds cheered. At the center, the original cart was pulled by the vendor himself, now retired but honored as the heart of the movement. Beside him walked the CEO, no suit, no speech, just a smile. He turned to the vendor and asked, "You remember that day?" The vendor laughed. "Which one?" "The first samosa." The vendor paused, eyes soft. "You remember it more than I do." The CEO replied, "Because it saved my life." Umeed's growth sparked not just a movement, but a ripple of copycats. New startups emerged, mimicking the model, but without the soul. They used slick branding and mass production, yet their carts lacked the warmth. The CEO noticed. Investors urged him to scale faster, compete aggressively. But he hesitated. "We're not just vending machines," he said in a meeting. "We're memories on wheels." One executive scoffed. "Ew, kindness doesn't scale." The CEO looked him dead in the eye. "It did for me." That night he visited a cart in a poor neighborhood and served samosas himself, apron on, grease splattered. Customers blinked in disbelief. He didn't explain. He just worked, like the vendor once did. One night, after returning home greasy and exhausted, the CEO opened an old drawer. Inside was the tin box, untouched for years. He lifted the lid and unfolded the letter he wrote as a boy. The ink had faded, but the words hit just as hard. "Repay every bite." He realized he'd kept his promise, but he hadn't shared it. He scanned the letter and posted it anonymously on Umeed's internal portal. No names, no tags, just truth. The next day, dozens of employees reposted it. "This is why we work," one wrote. Another commented, "It's not just food, it's faith." The CEO never claimed authorship. He didn't need to. A crisis struck. Supply chain delays, power outages, and a street protest all collided. Carts shut down. Sales dropped. Vendors panicked. The board demanded cuts. "We need to survive," they said. The CEO listened, then stood. "We'll pause growth, not cut people." He redirected bonuses, froze his own salary, and personally delivered inventory to critical zones. Videos emerged of him hauling crates at dawn, sleeves rolled up. The media tried to spin it as PR, but the vendors knew better. "He's one of us," they said. He never left. In the worst storm, he chose loyalty over profit, and it saved them all. Months later, the crisis waned. The carts rolled again, but something deeper had changed. Trust had crystallized. Vendors didn't just see a company, they saw family. In one district, a young vendor held a community feast, serving free food from his own cart. When asked why, he said, "Because someone once gave without asking." That line made its way to the CEO. He smiled, heart full. The vendor was barely 20, his face familiar, too familiar. It was his old self, reflected forward. Another hungry child fed. Another cycle broken. This was legacy. Not in dollars. In dignity passed down. That night, the CEO stood on the rooftop of Umeed HQ, watching the city shimmer. Thousands of carts. Thousands of lights. But one corner glowed brightest, the old street where it began. He raised a cup of chai, alone, silent. Somewhere down there, a boy once sat starving. Somewhere, a vendor once gave without hesitation. And now? Now they'd become a movement. $1 billion one, yes. But more than that, 1 billion unseen kindnesses stitched together. He whispered into the wind, "We made it." And the wind answered with nothing. Just peace. And that was enough. The vendor's health declined. Age, time, and the years of standing on pavement caught up. He was admitted to a modest hospital, surrounded by flowers sent from people he didn't remember helping. The CEO sat quietly at his bedside, hands folded. The vendor chuckled weakly, didn't think feeding one boy would end like this. The CEO smiled through tears. You didn't just feed me, you lit a fuse. Nurses paused outside the door, watching the bond between two men from different times, one who gave, one who never forgot. Promise me, the vendor whispered, don't ever let it become just business. The CEO nodded. It never was. The vendor passed away 3 days later. The funeral was simple, just as he would have wanted. But hundreds showed up. Vendors, students, workers, children. People from every walk of life. Some brought samosas wrapped in old paper. Others carried signs, "Thank you for the first bite." The CEO stood at the edge of the crowd, silent, tears on his cheeks. When it was time to speak, he simply said, he didn't build an empire, he built people. Then he stepped down. Because there were no words grand enough to honor a man whose only weapon was generosity. To honor the vendor's memory, Umeed launched the First Bite Fund, a foundation offering micro-grants to street vendors across Pakistan. Applicants didn't need a resume, just a story. Tell us what you'd do if given the chance. The application read. Stories poured in. Single mothers, war widows, teenage brothers trying to finish school. Every grant came with a message. This is from someone who once gave a hungry child his first bite. The CEO didn't appear in the ads. Instead, the faces of vendors filled the billboards. And for once the streets told their own stories. Loud and proud. One day, while visiting a remote village, the CEO noticed a small wooden cart with a solar panel taped to it. The design looked eerily familiar. A young girl, no older than 10, stood behind it. Where did you get this? He asked. My mother used to work with Umeed, she said. She taught me. The CEO crouched down. And you run this? She grinned. After school, one samosa at a time. He bought 3. As he bit into one, tears welled up. Not from spice, but from recognition. The chain hadn't broken. It had multiplied. From hands to hands. From bite to bite. That evening, the CEO returned to his office and placed a framed photo of the vendor beside his desk. Beneath it a plaque read, "The man who asked nothing." As the city lights blinked beyond the glass, he opened a notebook and scribbled 3 words. Next chapter begins. He no longer felt like a boy chasing dreams. He was the keeper of one. A dream built not on capital, but compassion. His legacy would not end with success. It would begin again, every time someone shared, fed, and uplifted. Quietly, like he once was. Like so many still are. On the 10th anniversary of Umeed, the CEO found himself standing beneath the dazzling lights of an international summit in Geneva. He wore a simple kurta beneath his blazer. A quiet homage. All around him, cameras clicked, interpreters whispered into earpieces, and dignitaries sipped champagne. But when he took the stage, everything went silent. No slideshow. No applause. Just a man carrying a memory. I was saved by a samosa, he began. A ripple of laughter passed, uncertain. One man gave me food when the world gave me nothing. That single act, he paused, changed the course of not just my life, but thousands. He paced slowly. We talk about business models, disruption, scalability. But what about grace? What about sacrifice? He looked out at the crowd. Legacy isn't built in boardrooms. It begins at sidewalks. The applause didn't erupt. It swelled. Wave after wave, until the entire room stood. Not for a billionaire, but for a story they suddenly felt part of. Backstage, as applause still echoed, a girl no older than 16 approached him timidly. Sir? She whispered. Her hair was tied in a rushed braid, her school uniform oversized. My father, he was a vendor. He passed last year, but before that, he watched your documentary. Every night. She reached into her bag and pulled out a frayed notebook. He called it his treasure, said one day, if I ever saw you, I should give this to you. The CEO took it gently. Its cover was stained. Inside, recipes, diagrams, quotes in Urdu, and scribbled dreams. He taught us to believe, she continued, that one act of kindness could echo forever. He knelt down. Your father is part of this. You are part of this. And this, he tapped the notebook, will live in every cart we build. She cried. Hi. And so did he. The following year, Umeed crossed its most symbolic milestone. It launched its 10th cart. But this time, it wasn't in Lahore. It was in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Jordan. A young Syrian boy, barely 9, stood behind the cart with cracked lips and dust on his cheeks. His sister sat beside him, legs tucked under a thin blanket. One for her, he said when asked who he was feeding first. A local aid worker snapped a photo, uploaded it. Caption: Hope travels. The image went viral. Not because it was sad, but because it was full of power, quiet resilience, and proof that empathy knew no borders. From the Philippines to Ghana, Chile to Lebanon, Umeed carts appeared, not as foreign aid, but as local lifelines. Each designed by locals, run by locals, fueled by the same unseen spark. Someone fed me, now I feed others. In a packed lecture hall at Oxford years later, gray now streaking his hair, the CEO sat on a guest panel. One student stood to ask, Sir, looking back, would you still choose to build Umeed? Wouldn't another path, tech, finance, have made you wealthier? He smiled. Wealth was never the destination. It was the byproduct of doing something that mattered. The room was silent. He went on. If I could go back, I wouldn't change the hunger, the loneliness, the waiting, because those moments carved empathy into me. And empathy? That's a blueprint money can't draw. Another student leaned forward. And the vendor. He turned to the window. Outside, across the campus street, was a food cart with students in line. A coincidence maybe, or maybe not. He's in every cart that feeds without judgment. Every bite someone gets without shame. He lives on. And not through me. Through all of us. One final night. No interviews. No summits. Just silence. The CEO, older now, walked barefoot across the cool marble of his home. He sat at his childhood desk, the one that once held borrowed textbooks and a candle. He opened the tin box. The original letter he'd written as a boy still sat there. He placed another beside it. My friend, my teacher, you once gave without question. I've spent a lifetime trying to deserve it. I built an empire from your gesture, and in doing so I met thousands like us, forgotten, unseen, hungry. Now they're not forgotten. Now they feed others. You may have left the world quietly, but your name is whispered in kitchens, sung on street corners, honored in lives changed. I never sit. He closed the box. Stood at the window. A distant cart flickered at a junction. Someone was being fed. Somewhere, a child would be full. He whispered into the darkness. He fed one. I fed many. Now, they'll feed millions. And that night, the silence felt like the final beat of a grateful heart.